The discovery of Tutankhamun's intact tomb was the greatest archaeological find in history. King Tut became a household name. Everyone knows about his golden treasures. But far more interesting is the story of his tragic childhood, his extraordinary love affair, and his sudden, mysterious death. Now, new clues are revealing the man behind the golden mask, the real Tutankhamen. The ancient Egyptians were compulsive about recording their heritage. They wrote everything down: battles, captives, offerings made to temples, and most important, their kings. If an Egyptian wanted to impress a foreigner with Egyptian civilization, he rattled off a list of kings. When the great traveler Herodotus visited Egypt, he said, "The priests read to me from a written record the names of 330 monarchs." The Egyptians were so proud of their long history that they recorded their kings on the walls of their temples. The best preserved of these lists is in the temple of Seti I at Abydos.
Here we are in the Hall of the Ancients. 3,000 years ago, a very important religious ritual took place here. Seti I, by reading the names of his ancestors, assured they would receive nourishment in the next world. Here's Seti. And this young man with the side lock of youth, he's a prince named Ramses. He'd grow up to be known as Ramses the Great. In his hand, he's got a papyrus roll. He's reading the names. And here are the names of the kings. They go from Mena, the founder of Egypt, to Seti himself. Each name is in a cartouche. It's an oval made out of rope that magically encircles the pharaoh's name. A little bit of magical protection always helps. Above, it tells what's going on. It's a prayer for the dead. May Ptah Sokar Osiris, Lord of the tomb, who is in Seti's temple, may he give offerings to the kings of Upper and Lower Egypt, from the Lord of the two lands, Seti I. May they have bread, beer, clothes, alabaster, everything they needed. And here are the names of the kings who would receive these offerings. Here's Cheops, the builder of the Great Pyramid. Down here, Amenhotep III. He ruled during the period of Egypt's greatest prosperity. But there's a problem right here. The name of the king that the world knows best is missing. Where is Tutankhamen? To start unraveling the mystery of Tutankhamen, you have to begin here, at Thebes, the ancient capital of Egypt. It was a place of fabulous wealth. Tributes flowed in from the Near East, gold from the south. Egypt was at its peak, the result of more than 1,000 years of stability. For centuries, the same gods were worshipped, the Nile regularly overflowed its banks, and the pharaoh's military exploits ensured continued prosperity. The Greek poet Homer wrote,
"Thebes of Egypt, where the greatest possessions lie up in the houses. Thebes of the 100 gates, 200 fighting men came forth to war, with horses and chariots."
It was an incredible place. And at this moment, when Egypt was at its greatest, the pharaoh Akhenaten had a powerful religious conversion. The divine and absolute ruler of Egypt became a heretic. Out went all the old gods, replaced by only one, the sun god, Aten.
With a small band of followers, he moved the capital from glorious Thebes to a desert wilderness 150 miles south of modern Cairo, a place now called Tel al-Amarna. It was here, during the most unique period in Egypt's 3,000-year history, that Tutankhamen was born. The pharaoh Akhenaten began to build his new city by placing boundary markers to define its limits. On them he proclaimed that there was only one god, the Aten, the sun god. Gone were all the familiar gods that Egyptians had worshipped for generations. No longer was there Osiris, the god of the dead, or Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification. Gone was Hathor, goddess of music and love. Bes, the lion-headed dwarf playing his tambourine. There was only the Aten, the solar disk whose rays brought life to all. This was the religion into which Tutankhamen was born. But these weren't Akhenaten's only changes.
Overnight, the style of art changed from formal to naturalistic. Where once the pharaoh was portrayed as well-muscled and vigorous, Akhenaten was shown as grotesque and deformed. Never in Egyptian history had a pharaoh been portrayed like this. His statues show an elongated face, swollen breasts, bulging thighs and spindly arms.
Even the pharaoh's wife, the famous Nefertiti, had thin arms and an unusually long neck. Their 6 daughters, the princesses, were depicted with deformed hydrocephalic heads, their skulls bulging out at the back. When early Egyptologists discovered these grotesque statues, they immediately sensed something bizarre had happened here. Even more surprising was the way the royal family was portrayed together. They were shown in intimate scenes, kissing and touching. Akhenaten was often shown holding one of his daughters on his knee in a tender family moment. Since the very beginnings of Egyptian civilization, no royal family had ever been shown in this manner. Centuries of traditions had just been swept away. Akhenaten also changed the political system that had been so successful for Egypt. In the past, Egypt's domination of the Near East had been built upon a large standing army, led by the pharaoh. With the king at its head, the army traditionally marched out to foreign countries to extend the borders of Egypt. After the army had conquered new land, they returned with everything of value that wasn't nailed down, and expected annual tribute to be sent, or they would be back. It was a simple system, and Egypt grew very rich. Akhenaten refused to do any of this. He simply wasn't interested. In his isolated city, he occupied himself with prayer to the god Aten and spent time with his wife Nefertiti and his children. Akhenaten turned the role of pharaoh from political leader into a religious one. These were remarkable times for Egypt, and into this tumultuous world, Tutankhamen was born. Across the river from Amarna, excavators discovered an inscription that states that Tutankhamen's father was a pharaoh. But which pharaoh? The answer is found in a remote valley where Akhenaten built his tomb.
This is where we're going to get our first glimpse of the real Tutankhamen, the man behind the golden mask. It's on this battered wall. It's really hard to look at, but you'll see clues that are absolutely unique in Egyptian history. It's a scene of the death of a royal person. If you can see this baby up here, she's on her nurse's hip. And over here, you have a fan bearer. That means it's a royal birth. And here, Akhenaten and Nefertiti. They're mourning. They're throwing sand on their head. Traditional ancient way of showing mourning. Here's the bed on which the princess has died. And here she is. The death of this princess enabled Geoffrey Martin, one of the world's greatest Egyptologists, to make an important breakthrough. What Professor Martin realized is that in this room is an almost identical scene. We have the mourners. Here's one bending down, grabbing sand, throwing it in her face. But this time, it's not the death of one of the princesses. It's the death of a wife of Akhenaten, a minor wife, Kia. And Martin suggests that the baby that's born is no less than Tutankhamen. This is where the life and story of Tutankhamen begins.
For Tutankhamen, growing up in the secluded city, life must have been very pleasant. Children were beloved in Egypt. The scribe Annie advised, "Marry young and have plenty of children." The geographer Strabo, who visited Egypt, reported with astonishment how many children the Egyptians raised. He thought the size of Egyptian families was a direct result of the fertile soil and warm climate of the country. Diodorus, another ancient traveler, observed that Egyptian children cost their parents virtually nothing. For while they were small, they went naked and barefoot, the boys wearing a necklace and the girls a comb and girdle. They could all feed, for practically nothing, on papyrus shoots and raw or boiled roots. Young children were particularly fond of pull toys, like a dog whose mouth revealed sharp teeth as it was opened and closed by pulling a lever. Older children played board games, and Tutankhamen must have enjoyed these. 6 sets of board games were found in his tomb. Like our modern Monopoly, pieces were moved on squares, with some stops being favorable and some unfavorable. You could land on very good, or life, prosperity, stability, but you could also land in the water. As a member of the royal household, Tutankhamen was undoubtedly taken each day to the brightly painted temple to worship the Aten in an atmosphere of tranquility and love. The Aten seems to have been unique. There was no negative aspect to the philosophy of Atenism. This was not an angry god, eager to punish naughty children. From the contents of Tutankhamen's tomb, we gain a few glimpses of the young king's personality. He was apparently fond of wine, for he was buried with nearly 3 dozen jars of fine wine. The jars are labeled as to the vintner, vineyard, and year of bottling. Many of the bottles are labeled from the estate of Tutankhamen. Most are dated to year 5 of his reign, so this was probably a vintage year. Only 4 of the jars were labeled sweet. The boy king liked his wine dry. The common man drank beer, with wine reserved for the upper classes. So the wine cellar Tutankhamen took with him to the netherworld was quite a treasure. But all these luxuries were little consolation for the tragedies that would soon strike the young king. While Tutankhamen was growing up, one of the most ambitious and cunning members of the court was named Ai. His tomb, cut into the eastern cliffs of Amarna, is the largest of all the nobles' tombs.
Here are Ai's titles. They're really interesting. The first one is the god's father. Now, the god is Akhenaten, but he's not literally his father. It means he's very close to the pharaoh. The second one is my favorite. It's fan bearer on the right-hand side of the king, which means he's literally Akhenaten's right-hand man. And there are other titles. This one here, overseer of the horses. Now, if you want to see how I got these titles, that's over here. Now, here's our man Ai. And the hand, that's a position of worship. So he's worshiping the one God permissible here. He's worshiping the Aten. Behind him is Mrs. Ai. She's got a beautiful wig on, cone of incense on her head, and her hands are in the same position. They're both worshiping the Aten. Now, if you want to see the rewards that this brings, come over here. There's a scene over here that shows just how you were rewarded at Amarna. There's Akhenaten, and behind him is Nefertiti. But right above them is the Aten, the solar disk with its rays coming down. What they're doing is they're handing out gold necklaces to Ai and his wife. What's neat is the kids are along. There are 3 princesses with them, and they're helping Dad. One of the princesses has a tray of gold necklaces that she's handing to her mother right there. Also, you can tell just when this wall was carved, because there are 3 princesses, and Akhenaten and Nefertiti had 6. So this would place it about in the middle of Akhenaten's reign. Like everything else at Amarna, there's a mystery here too. Look at these columns. They're unfinished. The tomb isn't complete. When the workmen reached this point, they put down their tools, walked away, and never came back. We know that Ai continued living for years after this point. So why did the most powerful official at Amarna leave his tomb unfinished in the middle of his pharaoh's reign?
The reason Ai stopped work on his tomb is that all was not well at Amarna, and Ai had no intention of living out his days there. Akhenaten was a religious leader, but economically and politically, Egypt was going downhill quickly. Foreign territories were lost, Egyptian ambassadors wrote that they were no longer respected, and the army was in a state of disrepair. Even the new religion was not a success. People missed their old gods, and Akhenaten and Nefertiti were forced to bribe the residents of Amarna to appear to be faithful. In the 17th year of his reign, Akhenaten died under unknown circumstances. Sometime before Akhenaten's death, Nefertiti ceases to be mentioned, and we can only assume that she died as well. Soon the town of Amarna was deserted. One indication of just how badly everyone wanted to forget the Amarna episode is that the famous bust of Nefertiti, one of the greatest works of art in the history of the world, was left behind on the sculptor's shelf. No one wanted it. Egypt was now without a king or queen. Little Tutankhamen was married to his 11-year-old half-sister, Ankhesenamen. Young Tutankhamen, the only male heir, thus became pharaoh. Akhenaten's revolution was simply too much of a change for conservative Egypt. Thebes, with its 2 great temples, was once again the religious center of the country. The thousands of priests, neglected for the 17 years of the Amarna experiment, could finally return to their rituals and worship the gods of ancient Egypt. Tutankhamen, accompanied by his new wife, Ankhesenamen, took up residence in the palace of his ancestors. Imagine what it must have been like for the young boy to be uprooted from the only home he had ever known and brought to a city he had never seen.
It's hard to believe, but this was once a palace of dazzling beauty. It sprawled for 80 acres. There were gardens, lakes. But the reason it's in ruins is this: mud brick. Most of ancient Egypt was built out of it. Temples, tombs had to be built out of stone to last for eternity. But a palace just had to last a lifetime. In this throne room, an 11-year-old orphan began his reign as king of Upper and Lower Egypt, lord of the two lands, Tutankhamen. But clearly, young Tutankhamen wasn't making the state decisions. Almost certainly it was I, promoted to the role of vizier, the highest office in the land, who was determining the fate of Egypt.
Tutankhamen wasn't the only boy pharaoh in Egyptian history. A letter written 1,000 years earlier by another boy king reminds us that although Tutankhamen was king of Upper and Lower Egypt, he was also a child. During young Pepi II's reign, his viceroy to Nubia wrote to him to say he was returning with a pygmy. The excited Pepi wrote back with instructions. The viceroy was so honored at receiving this long letter from the young pharaoh that he had it carved outside his tomb in Aswan for all to see.
Come forth to the palace immediately. Leave everything and bring the pygmy. When he goes down with you to the boat, put strong men one on either side of him. Take care lest he fall in the water. When he sleeps at night, appoint trusty people to sleep with him in his tent. Inspect him 10 times a night. My Majesty wishes to see this pygmy more than the produce of the Sinai and Punt.
He may have been a pharaoh, but he was still just a kid. In their young lives, Tutankhamen and his wife Ankhesenamen had seen more than their share of tragedy. They must have clung to each other during the devastating aftermath of their father Akhenaten's death. And after his death, there's no mention of Queen Nefertiti, who probably died about the same time. Now they were orphans, forced to move to Thebes, leaving behind their home, their religion, and even the loving memories of their father, now branded a heretic. From the objects found in Tutankhamen's tomb, it would seem as if the young couple were inseparable. One of the most touching pieces found in the tomb was a small golden shrine that once housed a statue of Tutankhamen. Each of the scenes on the shrine shows Ankhesenamen in the role of a loving, supportive wife. The vignettes show the royal couple in scenes of intimacy. They're touching. As Tutankhamen hunts, Ankhesenamen holds his next arrow. Tutankhamen pours perfume on his bride's hands. Obviously, they're devoted to each other and enjoy being together. For political reasons, their marriage ceremony took place when they were still children, but a real bond of affection between husband and wife clearly existed. The shrine was probably commissioned by Ankhesenamen as a gift for her husband. In a sense, it was a love letter written in gold. They were a magical couple, and in the tomb was a magical lamp. That was their special secret. The alabaster vessel has nothing painted on the outside, nor on the inside. But when it is lit, the young couple appears. The trick is that there's a second, smaller cup carved to fit inside, on which the couple has been painted. So it can only be seen when the lamp is lit and becomes translucent. Magic toys must have provided welcome relief for the young boy king, for all was far from well in the court of Tutankhamen.
Here in this corner of the Cairo Museum is another crucial clue to what's going on. This is a public notice. It was set up in Karnak Temple, the great religious center of Thebes. Shortly after the return to Thebes, the powers guiding Tutankhamen decided that they should establish him as returning to the old gods. And this is how they did it. These 3 lines of hieroglyphs up here, they tell a horrible story. What it says is the gods and goddesses of Egypt, from Elephantine Island to the marshes of the Delta, had been abandoned. Their shrines had fallen into disrepair and were overgrown with weeds. The country was in confusion. The gods had forgotten this land. What they're basically doing is blaming Tutankhamen's father for the horrible state Egypt has gotten into. Now, when this stela was erected, Tutankhamen was probably 12 years old. These aren't the words of a 12-year-old boy. Someone was blaming his father for the ills of the world. Think about how he must have felt. He must have felt horrible.
When Tutankhamen returned to Thebes, one of the first things he did was to complete a monument begun by his grandfather, Amenhotep III. Here at Luxor Temple, Amenhotep had built a colonnade, but he died before it could be decorated. The scenes Tutankhamen chose are of the most important and traditional festival in Thebes, the Festival of Opet. Opet is the ancient Egyptian name for Karnak Temple. Once a year, the statues of the three most important gods of Thebes, Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, were placed in small shrines and brought from Karnak to Luxor for all to see. There were processions, tables piled high with joints of meat as offerings to the gods. Music, hand clapping, singing and dancing. It was a time of excitement, and Tutankhamen portrayed it all. He too participated and had himself shown making offerings to the gods, and he would have had his name carved all over the place.
There's a real problem here. Tutankhamen decorated all of these walls. His name should be everywhere. But the only place you can find it is here, in this out-of-the-way part of the temple. These three little hieroglyphs spell out one of his names, Neb-Keperu-Re. Somebody was trying very hard to eradicate every trace of Tutankhamen.
Tutankhamen and Ankhesenamen were undoubtedly close to each other because of the tragedies they endured together. The excavation of Tutankhamen's tomb revealed yet another tragedy they shared. Ankhesenamen had suffered 2 miscarriages. In a small room off the burial chamber, 2 miniature wooden coffins were found. Inside were 2 fetuses. Howard Carter, the discoverer of the tomb, unwrapped the smaller one and noted that it was approximately 5 months into maturity and showed no signs of having been mummified. The second fetus was sent to Dr. Douglas Derry, professor of anatomy at Cairo University. He unwrapped it and noted it was an 8-month female fetus. This one had been embalmed. Derry mentioned that he found the wire which the embalmers used to remove the brain still in place in the skull. The fetus has curiously disappeared in the 1930s. But recently, the larger one was rediscovered at Qasr Al Aini Hospital, where Derry had stored it. When the smaller fetus was found last year, Dr. Fauzi Gabella, chairman of the anatomy department, invited me to examine both fetuses.
Usually the resin in the skull would be introduced through the nasal passages.
Yes, in adult skull.
Right.
But here, in an immature baby, which was about 8 months, intrauterine life, it is easy to put the resin through.
This was an exciting moment for me. My specialty is mummies, and on an intellectual level, I very much wanted to see if the smaller fetus had been mummified. On a more personal level, I would be as close to Tutankhamen and Ankhesenamen as I would ever get.
The anterior fontanelle.
Yeah. The incision here on the left is the same as always on the left, lower abdomen.
This is the area where the resin entered inside and where the abdominal organs were taken out. And what is very interesting is that you find that this area is still gapping. They didn't suture it. Right. So it is still open like this, you see.
Yeah. One of the things that always puzzled me is they often said in the early literature, it was the mummies were examined by Howard Carter and then later by Derry, the anatomist at Cairo University.
Yes.
They said that the smaller of the two fetuses, Ankhesenamun, had two miscarriages. This is the larger one.
Yes.
And they said that the smaller one wasn't mummified because they didn't see an incision in the lower abdomen. But over here, let's look at it.
This smaller fetus, unfortunately, was affected with much degeneration. But the resin is clear and is apparent here in the lower part of the abdominal cavity. You can see the resin as black area, but the incision itself is not apparent because of the degeneration. And this resin has the same color and the same texture and the same appearance as that of the larger one.
Yeah.
But the site of incision is not clear because of the degeneration.
It's very friable.
Very friable, this area.
Think about the skill of the ancient embalmers.
There is a resin here.
Working on this tiny little girl, they probably tried to remove the internal organs through an abdominal incision. These guys were incredible.
And underneath there is a mass of linen soaked with the resin, black area.
Yes.
So it should have been embalmed also. Why
Certainly.
not?
Certainly
Yes.
was mummified. Absolutely.
Looking at these two tiny humans, one can only help but wonder what would have happened if Tutankhamen and Ankhesenamun had had children that survived. If they had a male heir, the hopes of anyone else wanting to be king would have been crushed, and the course of Egyptian history altered forever.
Lurking in the shadows was the boy king's worst nightmare. Shortly after Tutankhamun was crowned king, I became vizier of Egypt, the equivalent of prime minister. He undoubtedly had a strong influence over Tutankhamun and the decisions he made.
I, of course, now had access to every resource and luxury in Egypt. He would have held lavish banquets, with musicians and servants attending to his every wish. An army of artisans and craftsmen prepared the goods for his tomb that would accompany him to the next world. In addition to advising the king and dispensing justice, the vizier had another extremely important power. He controlled access to the palace. No one could enter or leave without his knowledge and permission. Among Ai's servants, there were undoubtedly those who would do evil as easily as good.
One of the rare glimpses we have of Tutankhamun in his official role as pharaoh is in the tomb of Hoi, his viceroy to Nubia. Here we see the young king carrying out his official duties on his own. Hoi was an important official in Tutankhamun's court. His job was to keep the gold flowing from Nubia into Egypt. The ancient Egyptian word for gold was Nub, so Nubia, today's Sudan, was the place of gold. Indeed, the gold for Tutankhamun's coffin may well have been supplied because of Hoi's conscientious efforts.
The walls of Hoi's tomb tell the story of his job. Hoi took the oath of office and then received the official seal with which the gold shipments would be stamped. As Hoi returns from Nubia, we can see his horses peeking from their stalls. His tomb decoration is dominated by Nubians, bringing tribute to Tutankhamun. Giraffes, monkeys, and countless rings of gold. By the time Hoi was buried, Tutankhamun was a young man coming into his own, capable of thinking for himself, and perhaps no longer willing to be manipulated by his powerful vizier, Ai. This new independence may have cost him dearly. Then suddenly, mysteriously, aged only 20, Tutankhamen died. His body was mummified, ferried across the river to the West Bank, the place of the dead. And there he was buried with the other pharaohs of Egypt in the Valley of the Kings.
This is the most famous tomb in the world, but everyone who visits it is disappointed. It's not much, is it? But nobody expected Tutankhamen to die so young. They didn't have time to prepare a proper tomb, but there are still wonderful things in it. Like over there, Tutankhaмен's still here, in that sarcophagus. Isn't that neat? He's the only one they left in his tomb. And there are other wonderful things, the paintings. If you know how to read them, they'll tell you about the burial of Tutankhamen. It took 70 days to mummify the body, and that's all the time they had to get everything ready for this tomb. They had to get the coffins, the furniture, the sculptures, everything had to be here. And they had to do religious rituals, but they also had to select a new king. And that was a problem. Tutankhamen didn't have any sons, and the only living royal person was Ankhesenamen. But the wall here, it shows the day of the burial. Here's the mummy of Tutankhamen. He's on a funeral sled, and those 12 guys there, they're pulling him to this tomb. The little white headbands, that's for mourning, and these are the officials of the palace. But you know who's not there? I. He's over here. Look carefully at what he's wearing. He's got a leopard skin on. That's the sign of the high priest. And I is acting as the high priest, performing the opening of the mouth ceremony on Tutankhamen. He's going to give him life and breath for the next world. But look again, that's not all he's wearing. On his head is the crown of the pharaoh. And the cartouches above his head, they have the name of I. I has become pharaoh. He succeeded Tutankhamen. How did I, the commoner, become pharaoh?
Ankhesenamen must have been heartbroken by the sudden death of Tutankhamen, her young husband. Their relationship had been forged as young children, sharing the tragic aftermath of Amarna. Through all the turmoil and changes, they had always had each other as loving confidants. During the days immediately following Tutankhamen's death, a series of events transpired that make it probable that several murders occurred during this tumultuous period. The first of these events, a plea from Ankhesenamen, is recorded on an ancient tablet found in the archives of the Hittite capital, Bozaköy, in modern Turkey. Ankhesenamen's letter was so remarkable that even the recipient of the letter, the Hittite king, didn't believe it.
My husband died, a son I have not. But to thee, they say, the sons are many. If thou wouldst give me one son of thine, he would become my husband. Never shall I pick out a servant of mine and make him my husband. I am very afraid.
Why should Ankhesenamen be asking for a husband to be sent from outside the borders of Egypt, from the Hittites, a traditional enemy of Egypt? The Hittite king refused, thinking it was some kind of a trick. Desperate, Ankhesenamen wrote again.
Why do you say they may try to deceive me? If I had a son, would I write to a foreign country in a manner which is humiliating to myself and to my country? You do not trust me and tell me even such a thing. He who was my husband died, and I have no sons. Shall I perhaps take one of my servants and make him my husband? People say that you have many sons. Give me one of your sons, and he will be my husband and king of the land of Egypt.
So the king sent one of his sons to Egypt to marry the desperate Ankhesenamen. But he never made it. Somewhere in the wilderness, on an Egyptian border, he was murdered. Why was Ankhesenamen compelled to find a husband outside the borders of Egypt? In each of her letters, she declares she will never marry a servant. This is not a common phrase. There must have been a specific threat. Who could be forcing Ankhesenamun to take a commoner as her new husband? The answer was found more than 3,000 years later in the shop of a well-known Cairo antiquities dealer. In the spring of 1931, Percy Newberry, an Egyptologist, found in the store a finger ring with 2 cartouches, one of Ankhesenamun, the other of Ai. Newberry immediately wrote to Howard Carter with his revelation.
My dear Carter, it will interest you to know that I have just seen a finger ring which has on it the cartouche of Ankhesenamun, alongside the prenomen of King Ai. This can only be interpreted as meaning that King Ai has married Ankhesenamun, the widow of Tutankhamen.
It was the old Vizier Ai who was the servant that Ankhesenamun so desperately wished to avoid. Her urgent letters to the Hittite king, the ring found by Professor Newberry, and the scenes of Ai on Tutankhamun's wall all confirm that Ai succeeded Tutankhamun as king of Egypt by marrying the frightened young widow. What happened to Ankhesenamun after her marriage to Ai? When Professor Newberry discovered the ring, proving the marriage between the elderly Ai and the 21-year-old Ankhesenamun, he wrote to Howard Carter.
Is there any chance of your going out to the Western Valley to see the tomb of Ai? If you do go out there is a point that would be extremely interesting to settle. On one of the walls of the sarcophagus chamber, there's a figure of old King Ai, with Queen T behind him. Are there any traces of a figure behind Queen T? And is the cartouche big enough for the name of Ankhesenamun?
If Ankhesenamun were alive when Ai died about 3 years after the marriage, she should be shown on the walls of his tomb. So it's in Ai's tomb that we must look for clues to Ankhesenamun's fate.
Ai had several scenes painted on the walls of his tomb. These are religious. They show the gods welcoming Ai and he's being prayed for. But the one that Professor Newberry was interested in, the scene that'll tell us about Ankhesenamun, is over here. We've got Ai. He's hunting in the marshes. He's got his throw stick. And Ankhesenamun should be with him. She's his wife. She's the queen of Egypt. But the cartouche over here, it's too short for her long name. It's just the right size for the first wife of Ai, T. And this damaged figure here, that's T. But there's no room for Ankhesenamun behind her. And the hieroglyphs tell us T is the queen of Egypt. What happened to Ankhesenamun? In order for T to be queen, Ankhesenamun has to have died. Just as in order for Ai to become king, Tutankhamen had to be dead. We can only imagine that Ankhesenamun suffered a similar death to the Hittite prince and to Tutankhamen. Are we dealing with a serial killer? Could Ai have murdered his way to the throne?
In 1968, another clue in the mysterious death of Tutankhamen fell into place. Dr. R.G. Harrison, an English anatomist, carried out a unique medical examination. Egyptian authorities had granted special permission for the sarcophagus of Tutankhamen to be opened for the only time since the 1920s. Watched by amazed tourists, the corpse was once again revealed. By now, portable X-ray machines were available, and for the first time, the body of Tutankhamen was X-rayed. The results were dramatic, as Harrison identified evidence of a blow to the back of the skull of the long-dead king.
This is within normal limits, but in fact it could have been caused by a hemorrhage under the membranes overlying the brain in this region. And this could have been caused by a blow on the back of the head, and this, in turn, could have been responsible for death.
Now, no one had looked at Tutankhamun's x-rays since Harrison studied them more than 30 years ago. So I decided to get hold of a copy and took it to a well-known radiologist at my school, the C.W. Post campus of Long Island University.
Hi, Dr. Irwin. I've got it. I got the x-ray.
Hey, Bob. How are you?
Good. Anything you can tell me about it will be appreciated.
All right.
There it is.
Well, the theory that Dr. Harrison proposed is kind of interesting because I think there's an interruption here in the occipital bone, the posterior of the skull, which could represent a small fracture. And then he felt that this darker area in here represented the blood clot. Mm-hmm. If that's so, and this is the other side of the blood clot, it suggests that the clot has calcified. Now that would mean that this has been there for quite some time, a matter of maybe several months, and you'd have to be alive during that period of time in order to get that calcification.
So if Tutankhamun received a blow to the back of the head here, he would have lingered, not dying immediately.
If this is a blood clot, as proposed, right. That's now, true. He would have to have lingered for quite a while.
What would his state of consciousness have been? Would he have been unconscious, probably, or?
Initially, he might have even been able to function somewhat, but certainly with a clot this size in the confined area of what we call the posterior fossa, the back of the skull, this causes really a massive pressure on the midbrain and the cerebellum area. And he certainly could have been unconscious and then unconscious for quite a while in order to develop the calcification.
Interesting. What can you tell me about the position where he was hit? What position would he have been in when he received this blow to the back of the head? Is there anything you can...
Well...
Is it a normal place to receive a blow to the back of the head?
Not usually. It's pretty close to the base of the neck here. We have a mannequin over here, and perhaps I could show you on the mannequin. Yeah. Now, if he was lying down like this, the blow would have had to come right about here. The neck comes into this area, and the base of the skull comes here. There's a skull over here, if I could. And if we put him in about this same position, the neck, the cervical spine, would be here.
Right.
And that area where we think is the fracture is right across here. So the blow would have had to come something like this.
So he could have been sleeping in a prone position when the blow was delivered.
That's true, or he could have had his head this way and been struck like that.
Then perhaps goes into unconsciousness, might even last for a month or two that way, and then dies as a result of that blow.
Correct, correct.
Interesting. Thank you. That's great.
Thank you. Okay.
Our new X-ray evidence suggests that I may have in fact had several months to plot his bid for the throne. If I murdered Tutankhamen, Ankhesenamun, and the Hittite prince, why wasn't he brought to justice? The answer is written on the walls of the tomb of Rekhmire, who recorded the duties and powers of the vizier.
ممكن هنا؟ تمام. Here's the key. Let no one judge in the hall of the vizier. It is he who should punish the wrongdoer. In other words, no one punishes the vizier. We don't have a smoking gun, but what is clear is that Tutankhamen, Ankhesenamun, and the young Hittite prince all had to die within a few months for I to become pharaoh. It was I, as vizier, who could arrange for Tutankhamen to be murdered in the palace. It was I who could arrange for the young Hittite prince to be killed on the borders of Egypt. And it was I alone who could force Ankhesenamun to marry him and then have her murdered. This strange sequence of events that occurred in Thebes 3,000 years ago was all to the benefit of I.
In the end, I's efforts brought few rewards. He died 3 years after becoming king, His tomb was robbed, his mummy destroyed, his name erased, and the precious objects he planned to take with him to the next world were stolen. Today, his name is unknown, remembered only by Egyptologists because he succeeded Tutankhamen as pharaoh. As for Tutankhamen, the ancient Egyptians so hated what his father had done that they systematically removed all traces of Tutankhamen's memory. That's why Tutankhamen's cartouche isn't included on the walls at Abydos, where all the kings of Egypt are listed. That's why his name was erased from the Luxor temple colonnade that he decorated. But despite this, his name lives on. His small tomb in the Valley of the Kings, soon covered by the rubble from a later pharaoh's burial, remained untouched for 3,000 years. Tutankhamen, who suffered so much in life, rests in his tomb, the only pharaoh to remain buried in the Valley of the Kings. For him alone, the ancient Egyptian prayer came true. May the Lord of the two lands, King of Upper and Lower Egypt, Neb-Keperu-Re Tutankhamen, have life, health, prosperity, like Re forever.